September 22, 1945. San Diego, California. The sun dips below the Pacific horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the naval base. The city is alive. It is electric. Sailors in crisp white uniforms crowd the gas lamp quarter, laughing, drinking, and celebrating a war that everyone knows is practically over. The sheer scale of the American war machine is visible in the harbor. Dozens of destroyers, massive carriers, and Liberty ships sit at anchor. It is a display of unlimited wealth, unlimited steel, and unlimited power. The United States stands as the rich warrior of the world, a titan that has outproduced, outgunned, and outspent every enemy on the planet. To the people of San Diego, the war is something happening far away, across the vast ocean. It is a headline in a newspaper. It is a newsreel played before a movie. They believe they're untouchable. They believe the Pacific Ocean is a fortress that no enemy can breach. They are wrong. Because on this specific night, in a timeline that came terrifyingly close to reality, death was not coming from a bomb. It was not coming from a bullet. It was coming from the air, carried by the wings of the night, and it was microscopic. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you're holding your phone right now or watching this on your screen, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, do it now. Subscribe to World War II Dark Secrets. What the laughing sailors and the families in San Diego did not know was that thousands of miles away, a clock was ticking down. A plan had been finalized. A fleet was moving, and the payload wasn't explosives. It was the Black Death. This is the story of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. It is the story of how the Empire of Japan, in its final death throes, attempted to unleash a biological apocalypse on the American mainland. And it is the story of the unimaginable fury that the United States would have unleashed in return. To understand the horror of this plan, we have to look at the state of the world in the summer of 1945. The United States was a juggernaut. The American economy was generating aircraft carriers like they were automobiles. The U.S. Navy was larger than all other navies in the world combined. American soldiers were well-fed, eating steak and ice cream on forward operating bases, while their Japanese counterparts starved in the jungle, resorting to roots and snakes. This was the rich warrior dominance. The U.S. didn't just fight, it overwhelmed. It bought victory with an endless supply of resources. But wealth and industrial might cannot stop a disease, and the Japanese military knew this. They knew they could not match the American production lines. They could not build more tanks. They could not train more pilots. They had lost the conventional war. So they turned to the forbidden. They turned to the dark science that civilized nations had agreed to ban. Enter Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. If you do not know this name, you should. He is perhaps the darkest figure of the entire war, a man whose cruelty rivaled and in some ways exceeded the most notorious doctors of the Nazi regime. Ishii was the architect of Unit 731. Based in occupied Manchuria, Unit 731 was a factory of nightmares. It was a biological and chemical warfare research and development unit, but it was disguised as a lumber mill and water purification plant. The logs they processed were not wood, they were human beings. Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Korean captives, and even Allied prisoners of war. For years, Ishii and his team operated with unlimited authority and zero morality. They didn't just study diseases, they weaponized them. They performed vivisections on living patients without anesthesia to see how pathogens affected organs in real time. They froze prisoners' limbs to study frostbite and then struck them with clubs to see if they would shatter like glass. They locked men and women in pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. All of this suffering had a singular purpose: to create the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. A weapon that could bypass the massive aircraft carriers and the heavy armor of the American military. By 1945, Ishii had found his answer: the bubonic plague. the same disease that had wiped out a third of Europe in the Middle Ages. But Ishii wasn't satisfied with the natural version. He bred a strain of plague that was 60 times more virulent than the ordinary bacteria. And he found the perfect delivery system: fleas. Fleas were the carriers. If he could drop millions of plague-infected fleas onto a populated area, the insects would seek out warm bodies. They would bite rats, they would bite dogs, they would bite humans. The infection would spread silently, invisibly. Before the American doctors realized what was happening, the hospitals would be overflowing. Panic would destroy the city faster than any firebombing. But having the weapon was only half the problem. Japan was thousands of miles from the U.S. West Coast. The American Navy controlled the Pacific with an iron grip. Radar stations scanned the skies. Sonar nets guarded the harbors. How could Japan possibly deliver a biological payload to San Diego without being detected? The answer lay in another marvel of engineering, a secret weapon that the U.S. Navy didn't even know existed: the I-400 class submarine. These were not normal submarines. They were underwater monsters. The I-400s were the largest submarines ever built during World War II, a record they held for decades until the nuclear age. They were 400 feet long, displacing over 6,500 tons. To put that in perspective, they were nearly twice the size of the biggest American submarines. But their size wasn't their most dangerous feature. The I-400 was an underwater aircraft carrier. Inside a massive, watertight hangar on the deck, each I-400 carried 3 Aichi M6A attack float planes. These planes were designed specifically for this mission. Their wings folded against their bodies like origami. They could be launched by a compressed air catapult in minutes, surfacing, firing the planes into the sky, and then diving back into the safety of the deep before the enemy knew they were there. The plan for Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was finalized on March 26, 1945. 5 of these massive I-400 submarines were to cross the Pacific Ocean. They would travel silently, deep beneath the waves, bypassing the American patrols. They would utilize the vastness of the ocean to hide. They would approach the coast of Southern California under the cover of darkness. The target date was set for September 22, 1945. The mission profile was simple and suicidal. The submarines would surface just off the coast of San Diego. The crews would race to the deck. They would roll out the Siran aircraft. They would unfold the wings. They would attach the special ceramic bombs. These bombs were not filled with explosives. They were filled with millions of plague-infected fleas bred in the labs of Unit 731. The pilots, knowing this was a one-way trip, would take off. They would fly low over the city, avoiding radar detection. They would reach the densely populated centers of San Diego, the housing districts, the military barracks, the busy streets, and then they would crash. They wouldn't drop the bombs. They would serve as the bombs. Kamikaze pilots guiding their disease-ridden aircraft directly into the heart of the American city. The ceramic casings would shatter on impact. The fleas, millions of them, would be released into the warm California night. Imagine the scene. It is a Saturday night. Families are sleeping with their windows open to catch the ocean breeze. Sailors are stumbling back to their bunks. The city is quiet. Suddenly, the roar of engines tears through the silence. Explosions rock the streets. Fire alarms scream. But the fire isn't the danger. As the dust settles, the survivors crawl out of the wreckage. They cough. They check for injuries. They don't notice the tiny dark specks hopping off the debris. They don't feel the pinprick bites on their ankles. Within days, the symptoms would start. High fever, swollen, painful lymph nodes, blackening of the skin, coughing up blood. The plague would move through San Diego like wildfire. The rich warrior nation, with all its battleships and billions of dollars, would be brought to its knees by an enemy it couldn't shoot. Quarantine lines would be established. The Pacific Fleet, the pride of the Navy, would be paralyzed, its crews dying in their bunks. The panic would spread to Los Angeles, then San Francisco. The West Coast would become a quarantine zone. This was the plan. It was real. The submarines were built. The planes were built. The fleas were bred. The pilots were trained. So why didn't it happen? Why are we not speaking about the great San Diego plague of 1945?
The story of why this mission failed is a story of timing, of military collapse, and of a decision that changed history. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't just the attack itself, it is what would have happened next. Because the United States of 1945 was not a nation that took a hit lying down. The U.S. was a nation of overwhelming, vengeful power. We had the atomic bomb. We had the B-29 superfortress. We had a production capacity that was churning out destruction on a planetary scale. If Japan had succeeded in dropping the Black Death on San Diego, they would have woken up a beast far more terrible than they could have imagined. The American response would not have been a surrender. It would not have been a negotiation. It would have been an extermination. To understand the scale of the retaliation, we have to look at the mindset of the American leadership at the time. President Harry Truman, the military generals, and the American public were already weary of the war, but they were also fueled by a deep, burning rage. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had ignited a fire that had driven the U.S. across.
To understand how close the world came to this biological nightmare, we must descend into the steel belly of the beast. The I-400 class submarine was a technological marvel born of desperation. The Japanese engineers, working with dwindling resources, had achieved the impossible. They had built a machine that defied the conventional logic of naval warfare. Imagine standing on the deck of this Leviathan. It was a monster of the deep. The hangar tube alone, a massive cylindrical structure sitting atop the hull, was over 100 feet long. It was pressure-resistant, designed to protect the delicate aircraft from the crushing depths of the ocean. Inside this tube, the 3 Siren bombers sat in a line, their wings folded, their floats detached, like sleeping bats waiting for the night. The crew of the I-400 lived in a world of claustrophobic tension. These were not ordinary sailors, they were the elite. They knew their mission was different. They weren't hunting merchant ships, they were carrying the spear that would pierce the heart of the American homeland. But even among the crew, the true nature of their final payload was a closely guarded secret. Most knew they were going to attack the U.S., few knew they would be carrying the plague. The pilots of the Siren aircraft were a breed apart, trained in the tradition of the samurai, but equipped with the tools of the 20th century. They were prepared to die. But unlike the kamikaze pilots in the Philippines who crashed Zeros into battleships, these men had a mission that required complex navigation and timing. They had to launch from a surfacing submarine, assemble their planes in the dark, take off from a short catapult, and navigate to a city that was glowing with light. San Diego in 1945 was a beacon. Because the U.S. mainland had not been attacked since 1812, aside from a few minor shelling incidents and balloon bombs, the West Coast cities had relaxed their blackout restrictions. The rich warrior was confident. The lights of the gas lamp quarter, the naval yards, and the residential hills would have been visible from miles offshore. It was a target that couldn't be missed. Back in Manchuria, at the Ping Fan facility of Unit 731, the preparations were gruesome. Shiro Ishii, the Doctor of Death, was overseeing the mass production of the weapon. We have to be graphic here to understand the threat. Ishii's team wasn't just breeding fleas in a few test tubes, they had industrial incubators. They used thousands of rats to feed the fleas. They harvested the fleas by the millions. These fleas were infected with Yersinia pestis, but Ishii had tweaked the bacteria. He had passed it through generation after generation of human hosts, the prisoners he called logs, to increase its lethality. He wanted a strain that killed quickly and spread easily. He wanted a plague that modern medicine couldn't stop. The ceramic bombs were a stroke of evil genius. A conventional metal bomb would explode with too much heat, killing the fleas instantly. Porcelain, however, was brittle. It would shatter on impact with the ground or a building, releasing the cloud of insects without incinerating them. The fleas, agitated and starving, would immediately seek a host. Now, consider the American defense.
The U.S. West Coast was guarded, yes. There were interceptor squadrons, there were radar stations, but looking for a submarine in the vast Pacific Ocean in 1945 was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Sonar technology was good, but it had limits. Thermal layers in the ocean could hide a submarine from detection. The I-400 was designed to stay submerged for weeks, using a snorkel to run its diesel engines while staying mostly underwater. If the I-400 fleet had reached the launch point, the U.S. defenses would have been looking for bombers coming from the sky, not planes popping out of the ocean. The element of surprise would have been total. But let's look at the unknown story, the friction that happens in war. While Ishii was finalizing his plans, the U.S. Navy was systematically dismantling the Japanese Empire. The rich warrior was flexing its muscles. The U.S. submarine blockade had cut off Japan's oil. The B-29 firebombing raids were turning Japanese cities into ash. The infrastructure required to support the I-400 mission was crumbling. Fuel was the critical shortage. The I-400 submarines were massive and they were thirsty. To get them to San Diego and back, or even just to get them there, required thousands of tons of diesel. Japan didn't have it. They had to scavenge. They had to refine pine roots into crude oil substitutes. They had to smuggle fuel across the Sea of Japan under the noses of American bombers. This desperation highlights the contrast between the two combatants. The U.S. had fleets of oil tankers forming a conga line across the Pacific. They had floating dry docks. They had ice cream barges. Japan was trying to run the most advanced submarines in the world on fumes and hope. Despite these challenges, the Japanese Navy managed to scrape together enough fuel for the mission. The order was drafted. The target, San Diego. The date, September 22nd. But then, the twist occurred. The internal politics of the Japanese military began to fracture. The chief of the general staff, Umezu, was a hardliner, but he was also a traditionalist. When he reviewed the plan for Operation Cherry Blossoms at night, he hesitated. Not because of the cruelty, not because of the civilian casualties, but because he believed that biological warfare was an admission of defeat. He believed it was beneath the dignity of the Imperial Navy. He reportedly said, "If we do this, the war will be lost forever, even if we win the battle." He understood something that Ishii did not. He understood the nature of the American rich warrior. He knew that if Japan unleashed a biological plague, the United States would not stop at unconditional surrender. The Americans would seek total erasure. Umezu didn't want to give the Americans a reason to wipe the Japanese people off the face of the earth. But Ishii was relentless. He bypassed commanders, he used his connections. The plan was pushed forward again. The submarines were prepped, the Siren pilots practiced their night launches. They practiced assembling the planes in the dark, their hands moving with practiced speed over the bolts and latches. They could go from submerged to airborne in under 30 minutes. The terrifying reality is that the only thing that physically stopped the mission wasn't a moral epiphany, it wasn't an American commando raid, it was the collapse of the timeline. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped the Little Boy atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki was destroyed. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, overrunning the Unit 731 facilities. The chaos was absolute. The Japanese command structure shattered. The order to launch Operation Cherry Blossoms at night was lost in the confusion of a dying empire. The I-400 submarines, which were at sea, received a different order: surrender. But this brings us to the most chilling what-if of the entire war. What if the atomic bombs had been delayed? What if the Trinity test had failed? What if the invasion of Okinawa had taken 2 months longer? If the war had dragged on just 4 more weeks, the I-400s would have been in position off the coast of California. The atomic bombs were the only thing that stopped the biological bombs. It is a dark irony of history. The nuclear incineration of 2 cities may have saved San Diego from a biological apocalypse. But let's assume, for the sake of this narrative, that the mission went ahead. Let's assume the timeline shifted just slightly. The submarines surface, the planes launch, the fleas fall on San Diego. Part 3 of our story will explore this immediate aftermath. We will look at the American reaction in the first 24 hours. We will visualize the confusion, the denial, and then the dawning horror as the disease takes hold. And most importantly, we will look at the rich warriors' countermove. The U.S. had the bomb. They had the delivery systems. If San Diego had been hit with plague, the target list for the atomic bombs would not have been limited to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The target list would have been Japan. We are about to enter the realm of total war, a war where biology meets nuclear physics, a war where the gloves come off and the goal shifts from victory to annihilation. The fleas are released. The clock is ticking, and the sleeping giant is about to awake, screaming.
The engines of the Aichi Seiron float plane scream over the coastline. It is not a drill. It is not a movie. It is the end of the world arriving on painted wings. The time is 2 a.m. The radar operators at Point Loma pick up the ghosts on their screens, but it is too late. The low-flying aircraft are already over the city. In our timeline, these planes never launched. But in the timeline where Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night succeeds, this moment is the turning point of the 20th century. The pilots, knowing they are already dead men, do not aim for military targets. They do not aim for the battleships in the harbor. They aim for the density of life. They aim for the sprawling housing projects where factory workers sleep. They aim for the gas lamp quarter. They aim for the silent streets of Balboa Park. They dive. The sound of the engines wakes the city a split second before impact. Crash, crash, crash. 3 distinct explosions rock San Diego, but they are not the earth-shattering booms of high explosives. They are duller, crunchier sounds. The ceramic casings of the biological payloads shatter instantly. The planes disintegrate into fireballs, but the fire is secondary. The true weapon has been released. Millions of infected fleas are thrown into the air by the force of the impact. The heat of the crash kills some, but not all, not nearly enough. The survivors, agitated by the shock, land on the cooling debris. They land on the asphalt. They land on the lawns of nearby houses. They immediately begin to hop, seeking heat, seeking blood. The first responders arrive within minutes. Firefighters, police officers, and Navy shore patrolmen rush to the crash sites. They are brave men. They pull bodies from the wreckage. They hose down the flames. They trample through the debris. They are the first victims. The fleas latch onto their heavy turnout coats. They crawl into the cuffs of their trousers. They find the exposed skin of necks and wrists. The bites are tiny, barely noticeable in the chaos of the night. The rich warrior has the best fire trucks, the best radios, and the best trained men, but they have no defense against this. For the first 48 hours, there is confusion. The FBI investigates the crash sites. They find pieces of the planes. They identify Japanese markings. The news hits the papers. Jap suicide attack on San Diego. The public is outraged. They think it's a desperate failed bombing run. They think the enemy missed. They laugh at the futility of it. Then, the incubation period ends. It starts in the hospitals. The firefighters who responded to the crash are the first to collapse. High fevers, chills that shake the bed frames. They complain of excruciating pain in their groins and armpits. The doctors are baffled. They suspect smoke inhalation or chemical exposure. They give them penicillin, the miracle drug of the American war machine. But this is not a normal infection. Then the buboes appear, swollen black fluid-filled nodes the size of tennis balls. The doctors in San Diego have never seen this before. They have to open medical textbooks from the previous century. When the diagnosis is finally whispered, it drains the blood from the face of every medical professional in the room. Bubonic plague. Panic is a slow burn, then an explosion. The report goes up the chain of command, from the hospital chief to the naval admiral to the governor to the president. The realization is horrifying. This wasn't a failed bombing. It was a successful seeding. San Diego is locked down. The rich warrior responds with overwhelming force. The U.S. Army surrounds the city. Tanks block the highways. Machine gun nests are set up on the roads leading to Los Angeles. The order is given. No one leaves. Inside the quarantine zone, civilization crumbles. The plague, supercharged by Unit 731's genetic selection, moves faster than the medieval variety. It becomes pneumonic, airborne. People coughing in movie theaters infect entire rows. The hospitals are turned into charnel houses. The dead are piled in the streets because there aren't enough gravediggers. The psychological impact on the United States is catastrophic. The ocean was supposed to protect them. The Navy was supposed to protect them. But the enemy has reached inside their home and poisoned them. In Washington, D.C., the mood in the Oval Office shifts from concern to a cold reptilian fury. President Truman holds the report in his hands. He looks at his generals. He looks at the casualty projections. The Japanese have violated the Geneva Convention in the most grotesque way possible. They have used a weapon of mass destruction on American civilians. The question of unconditional surrender is off the table. The new objective is total annihilation. The United States has the resources. We have the rich warrior economy. We have the B-29s. And we have the bomb. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of the firebombing campaigns, is given the green light. He doesn't just want to burn cities anymore. He wants to erase the archipelago. The U.S. response begins with a message to the Japanese people, but it is not a warning to surrender. It is a notification of execution. The third shot is prepared. History tells us 2 atomic bombs were dropped, but the U.S. had a third core ready. It was scheduled for potential use in late August. In this timeline, the production lines at Los Alamos are shifted into overdrive. The Demon Core is prepped. A 4th core is rushed. A 5th. The target list is expanded. Kokura, Niigata, the ruins of Tokyo. Kyoto, previously spared for its cultural significance, is marked for immediate vaporization. But the American response isn't just nuclear. The U.S. stockpile of chemical weapons, mustard gas, phosgene, which had been held back due to fear of retaliation, is unlocked. If Japan wants to fight with biology and chemistry, the United States will answer in kind. The B-29 fleets launch from Tinian, hundreds of them. They darken the sky. They are not carrying leaflets. They are carrying fire and radiation. The rich warrior does not fight fair when it is angry. It fights to end the concept of the enemy. Back in San Diego, the dying continues, but the narrative shifts. The victims are not just casualties, they are martyrs that fuel a vengeance the world has never seen. The narrative of the good war dies. It becomes a war of extermination. This is the nightmare scenario. This is what Shiro Ishii almost unleashed, a chain reaction that would have turned the islands of Japan into a radioactive glass-covered wasteland empty of life. But now, we must pull back from the brink. We must return to the unknown story of what actually happened, because the ending of the real story is almost as shocking as the fiction. Why didn't the planes launch?
We know the war ended. We know the Emperor surrendered. But the I-400 submarines were already at sea. They were underwater, cut off from the chaos in Tokyo. They were prowling the Pacific, waiting for the date. The captain of the I-401, Lieutenant Commander Nambu, was a fanatic, but he was also a professional. When the radio operator finally picked up the broadcast from Tokyo, the Emperor's voice, shaking and thin, announcing the surrender, Nambu didn't believe it. He thought it was American propaganda. He had the plague planes on his deck. He had the course set for the U.S. coast. He could have ignored the radio. He could have launched anyway. Imagine the tension in that control room, the fate of millions resting on the decision of one man in a metal tube smelling of sweat and diesel. He looked at his orders. He looked at his crew. He made a choice. He chose obedience over glory. He chose to honor the surrender. But he couldn't let the Americans find the weapons. He knew that if the U.S. Navy found biological weapons on his ship, he and his crew would be executed as war criminals. So, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a bizarre funeral took place. The crew of the I-400s rolled the Sea-Ron aircraft out onto the decks. They didn't launch them. They catapulted them into the sea, unmanned. They smashed the ceramic bombs. They dumped the secret documents. They flushed the plague down into the crushing darkness of the abyss. They sanitized the crime scene before the police arrived. When the I-401 finally surrendered to the USS Segundo, the Americans were stunned. They had never seen a submarine this big. They marveled at the hangar. They marveled at the technology. But they didn't know what was inside that hangar just days before. The American sailors boarded the massive sub. They treated the Japanese crew with curiosity, unaware that these men had been days away from murdering their families back home. The rich warrior took the submarine as a prize. They sailed it back to Pearl Harbor. They studied it. They learned from it. But the story doesn't end with the sinking of the subs. There is one final dark secret to uncover.
The war is over. The mushroom clouds have faded. The treaties are signed on the deck of the USS Missouri. But in the shadows, a different kind of deal is being made. A deal that exposes the cold, pragmatic underbelly of the rich warrior. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, arrives in Japan. His job is to rebuild the nation and bring war criminals to justice. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal begins. Hideki Tojo and other leaders are arrested, tried, and hanged. But one man is missing from the gallows. Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. The Americans find him. They find his records. They discover the horrors of Unit 731. They learn that about the frostbite experiments, the vivisections, and the plans for Operation Cherry Blossoms at night. They learn that this man is a monster who belongs in the deepest circle of hell. But the Americans also learn something else. They learn that Ishii has data. Years of data. Data on how biological agents affect the human body. Data that no civilized nation could ever generate because no civilized nation would ever perform these experiments on people. The Cold War is beginning. The Soviet Union is the new enemy. The United States wants every advantage. The American intelligence officers look at Ishii's research. They look at the piles of notebooks detailing the spread of anthrax and plague. They realize this information is priceless. So a deal is struck. In exchange for handing over all of his research to the United States, Shiro Ishii is granted full immunity. Let that sink in. The man who planned to drop the Black Death on San Diego, the man who butchered thousands of innocent people, he is not prosecuted, he is not imprisoned, he is given a pass. The United States, the rich warrior, buys his secrets. They take the biological warfare data back to Fort Detrick in Maryland. They use it to jumpstart their own bioweapons program. The knowledge gained from the torture of Chinese civilians and Allied POWs becomes part of the American arsenal. Ishii lives out the rest of his life in peace. He dies of throat cancer in 1959, a free man in his own home, never having spent a day in a jail cell. The I-400 submarines meet a different fate. The U.S. Navy studies them in Hawaii. They are amazed by the engineering. But in 1946, the Soviets demand to inspect the captured Japanese technology as per the wartime agreements. The U.S. Navy refuses. They don't want the Russians to see the advanced submarine designs. So the rich warrior makes a decision. If we can't have them exclusively, no one can. On June 4, 1946, the USS Bluegill fires torpedoes at the captured I-401 off the coast of Hawaii. The giant submarine, the carrier of the plague, groans and slips beneath the waves. It sinks to the bottom of the Pacific, taking its secrets with it. It lies there today, a rusting tomb of a nightmare that almost was. This story serves as a critical warning. It shows us that the line between victory and catastrophe is razor thin. We often think of World War II as a war of tanks and planes, of soldiers and strategy. But in the final days, it was almost a war of extinction. The rich warrior dominance of the United States was absolute. We had the money, the steel, and the fire. But even with all that power, we were vulnerable to the microscopic. We were vulnerable to a few desperate men in a submarine with a jar of fleas. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night is a reminder that technology without morality is a gun pointed at the head of humanity. The Japanese built a marvel of engineering, the underwater aircraft carrier, and tried to use it to unleash the Dark Ages. The Americans built the atomic bomb, a marvel of physics, and used it to burn cities. And then the victors shook hands with the monsters to secure the data for the next war. History books will tell you the war ended with a bang, but the truth is, it almost ended with a cough. The lights of San Diego are still shining tonight. The families are sleeping safe in their beds. They don't know how close they came. They don't know about the submarines that prowled the deep or the ceramic bombs that were smashed on the deck. They don't know that the only reason they are alive is because a radio operator decided to listen and a captain decided to obey. The ocean keeps its secrets, but now you know. This has been World War II Dark Secrets. If this story chilled you, if it made you look at history differently, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks they know everything about the war, and don't forget to subscribe, because the archives are deep, and we are just getting started. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. You never know what's waiting in the dark.